We screamed into space and heard the echo. Part 2, Swordland. 2532, Castle of Heroes, Centralia, UVR. Lot 119-9169, please step forward. The lights blinded Lown as he stepped out onto the stage. He tried to raise his hand to shield himself from the glare, but his clanking iron manacles kept his hands to his sides. UVR was said to be the most immersive VR game, platform, ever devised. It was said that a triplet of general AI oversaw its functioning, everything from the physics to the highly interactive quests. One could not call them mere quests anymore, but a true simulation. A simulated world where players were free to do almost anything. Almost. So why, Lown wondered, was he a prisoner? He blinked as he tried to make out the darkened silhouettes beyond the spotlights that burned against his naked skin. This skin flushed red from embarrassment when he realized he was standing in front of a crowd of unknown size in little more than a loincloth, oversized beard and chains. Loincloth? That must be the starting equipment for this portion of UVR. Come to think of it, he couldn't remember doing character generation. Usually a player gets to choose their looks and class and equipment, but this game dumped him straight in. Perhaps this was the player tutorial part of the game. The sweat was beading on his brow and beginning to drip down over a pair of bushy unkempt eyebrows and making trails into his beard. Those spotlights were certainly hot. 119-9169, please stand still. The announcer's voice boomed over him, followed by hushed murmurs and tittering from the crowd. Lot 119-9169, Lown Blues, the announcer continued, addressing the crowd. A hale dwarven blacksmith from the heartlands now fallen to the demons. Shall we start the bidding at 10 gold? Silence followed. After a moment the announcer sighed. 5? Lown stopped listening and let his mind wander. This game was a medieval fantasy setting, but he didn't want to play as a blacksmith or a dwarf. It was a bit presumptuous of the game to shove him into any old race and class and use his real name. Lown was starting to think this game was overhyped and not that good after all. Lown clawed at the air in front of him, his chains rattling, as he tried to find the system menu, but nothing happened other than him looking like an idiot in front of the multitude of unseen leering faces. He could hear them mocking him, which made him scramble even more furiously. The announcer's voice boomed over him again, pulling him out of his panic. Will no one take in this exceptionally strong individual for 3 silvers? The insinuation was clear, he was worthless, which caused Lown to become even redder, though this time it was equal amounts of embarrassment and anger. Was this game made to mock him, and why could he not leave? The announcer continued, oblivious to Lown's feelings. Thank you, Nation of Felruin. Sold for 3 silvers. Next! Lot 119-9170, please step forward. Lown was roughly shoved off stage left and knocked his knee against the corner of a previously unseen crate. With a scowl he nursed his knee as hands hauled him further off stage. As soon as he was out of the searing spotlight, he could make out the 2 rough-looking guards in chainmail and peaked helmets shoved him along. He scowled through his beard as his manacled feet caused him to stumble, but he remained on his feet and shuffled on. Lown glanced around and noted that many more fantastical races, some wearing little more than himself, were being lined up and corralled to the stage. There were so many of them. Humans, elves, dwarfs, orcs, dragonutes. All the fantasy races of UVR. Lown would have been pleased with being a human or elf or even a dragonute, but dwarf was the lowest on his list of preferences. Not because dwarfs were weak, but because it was too close to his actual stature. Blacksmith was too close to what he actually did for a living. A game was supposed to be for getting away from the real world. Lot 119-9170, this lovely lady is. The announcer's voice lost its oppressive booming quality now that Lown was being hurried away down a side passage, but that voice could still rang clearly through the air. Lown considered for a moment that he would hear that voice in his nightmares. A saintess! The uproar of the crowd following the announcement was immediate, with values of gold in the thousands being shouted before the announcer could start the bidding. Lown couldn't care less, but the announcer wasn't done. And she wields the holy sword Caliburn. Loun glanced back at the crowd's gasps and he caught a glimpse of the white-robed, raven-haired beauty as she basked in the attention, a glittering golden sword in her unmanacled hands, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It sent a shiver down Loun's spine as he was thankfully dragged around a corner. Loun let out a grunt as he was dwarf-handled into an unremarkable room where he was left alone with who appeared to be anything but unremarkable. He was a pale-skinned human noble, judging by his fine coat, top hat and cane, with slightly pointed ears, soft elegant hands, and a much too condescending grin. "You, my good hero, must be bewildered, bemuddled, and bemused." The noble smirked, sniffing the lacy cuff on his far too velvety sleeve. On top of all that he wore a cape as well as golden jewelry that matched his shoulder-length straw-blonde hair. "You, dear dwarf, have been auctioned and brought by my humble little nation of Felruin. Perhaps you have heard of it?" Loun grunted as if he had been struck in the stomach. He remembered that Felruin was one of the 12 nations of this fantasy world. It was only notable as a place not to visit, known for somehow being made up of half desert and half icy tundra. It was the poorest of the nations, which made it the worst place to start. Not even the Demon Lord had seen fit to conquer it, according to the game's lore. This game truly was mocking him. "The hero seems displeased," the nobleman accurately observed, "but the hero is not to be blamed for their vexation." "Ah, but where are my own manners? I am Baron Dimitri, but you can address me as Nick. There is no need to stand on ceremony. After all, you are the hero that shall liberate my poor lands." Loun answered with a snort. Like hell. This was too much like back home and he didn't like it, not one little bit. However, something nagged at Loun. Something about the Baron. He was sure he had heard that name before, but he couldn't quite place it. "Not one for many words, I take it?" Baron Dimitri's grin slipped as a look of uncertainty passed over momentarily before that confident smile returned. Dimitri pulled a smithing hammer out from under his cloak and pushed it into Loun's hands. A tingling sensation passed through Loun as he gripped the tool. Was it his imagination or had the hammer greeted him? Whatever. There was no need to overthink his starting equipment. Loun gave the hammer a test swing, but his movement was hampered by his chains. Even so, he could feel that the hammer was well balanced. But why give him this hammer before something fundamental like clothes? Did the nobleman believe a beard was all a dwarf needed to wear? Loun glared at the Baron, waiting for something more to happen. Dimitri was watching Loun, sizing him up thoughtfully. Loun didn't like that look. It was like Loun was a slab of meat at the fabricator's. Meat. Baron Nick Dimitri. Baron Nicholas Dimitri. Loun let out a short grunt as a memory fell into place. Loun had read about this Baron before. The Baron was one of the bosses of the game. A powerful vampire that fought on the side of the final boss, the Demon Lord. The Demon Lord that the heroes were meant to defeat. Loun frowned as questions swarmed his mind. This wasn't how the game was supposed to work. Before he could ask any one of the tangles of questions he suddenly had, the Baron snapped his fingers, causing the manacles and chains to clatter to the floor. The Baron then clapped his hands twice. The door burst open with a flurry of skirts as maids poured in carrying folded bundles. Without a word they surrounded the freed Loun and began pouring him all over. Amidst the flurry of limbs, Loun let out a wordless exclamation when he felt his loincloth disappear. But he had no time to react before the singularly minded maids pulled other garments onto him. He had never had anyone dress him before, but all he could do was stand there awkwardly and let it happen. The huddle of servants broke away, leaving a gasping Loun now dressed in shirt, breeches, and boots along with an apron with a large pink heart on the front. If Loun had wondered before whether the game was mocking him, now he knew it for certain. He stood there silently, scowled at Baron Dimitri, as the maid swished out again. One should give thanks for one's benefactor and not glower like a razorhog after chipping a tusk. The Baron's admonishment was lessened by his attention being diverted to a purple crystal he had pulled out of his waistcoat. "The time is nearly upon us," Baron Dimitri said dramatically, "for the true performance to begin." A single scream echoed down the hallway. One which was abruptly cut short. It was followed by a chorus of other screams and shouts. The clanging of metal rang between the cries of alarm. The opening song is sung and the beginning chords are struck. We must hasten to our seats, Dimitri intoned as he hoisted Loun, tucking the heavy dwarf under his arm as if he were no more than a bag of scrap metal, before the nobleman sprouted bat-like wings and flew up into the ceiling. They crashed through the ceiling, shattered through the roof, and were quickly high above the city. A white-spiked castle like one straight out of a fairy tale was nestled in the center of the sprawling city. From their high vantage point the castle appeared at once majestic and beautiful, marred only by the plumes of black smoke rising in columns in multiple places. Throughout the city, flashes of lights blinked in multicolored arrays, with the majority originating from within the castle itself. Cracking booms followed seconds after some of the brighter blasts. Even though Loun had not seen spells in the game before, he assumed that there was a fierce battle raging below. That was the moment he realized how high up they were, making Loun cling to Dimitri as if his life depended on it. He had no idea what a fall from this height would do. Would it hurt? He would rather not find out. Loun glanced at the afternoon sun and then at the Baron, raising a quizzical eyebrow about the situation in general. "Ah! Astute observation, hero," Dimitri grinned as he hovered high above the carnage. What the vampire meant exactly Loun didn't quite understand, but he nodded, hoping Dimitri would continue. The Baron did not disappoint. "No, the sun won't kill me, as I am a superior and supreme being. Not one to be confused with the lesser crypt dwellers. Dracula? An amateur. But we cannot linger. The other heroes would have slain most of the demons by now. If they discover you, they shall surely detain you. Yes, that means you have gained freedom from the shackles of a hero. Your appreciation is most welcome." With a beat of his wings, Baron Nicholas Dimitri flew off with Loun draped over his arm, towards the setting sun, leaving the city of beginnings far behind them. 2532, Razorboar Plains, Centralia, UVR. The lush forests around Centralia's castle of heroes dwindled and gave way to plains of golden razorgrass that swayed in the gusting breeze. A trio of bald, heavily muscled humans covered in war paint, wearing little more than animal skins, and brandishing much too large, vicious-looking axes, waited with Loun in the shade of a single tree. Loun had been unceremoniously dumped before the three by Dimitri before the Baron flew off. Loun was of the opinion that he was not meant for flying, but he would take flying over the unfriendly faces of the muscle-bound brutes. Their silent glares weren't softened by the susurrus of the wind through their surroundings. Before he had left, Dimitri had told Loun, "My friends shall escort you to Felruin Castle." But before the dwarf could object or spring to his wobbly feet, Dimitri had flown off, leaving the hapless hero with the trio of barbarians. "Humph," Loun humped while watching the Baron disappear into the night. "How rude." Loun thought it again as a pair of rough barbarian hands picked up the dwarf and threw Loun over his shoulder. He was tired of being treated like a sack of scrap, but didn't protest as the three barbarians dashed off into the night, with one dwarf as their silently grumbling luggage. Loun eyed the three humans as they ran. Baron Dimitri had been scary but friendly. These barbarians were both scary and unfriendly, with their clean-shaven heads also dotted with multiple randomly placed piercings. The animal skins they wore appeared the standard savages' fare, but their equipment was actually quite decent adventuring gear. Dimitri called them friends that would be escorting Loun the rest of the way to where Loun was going, to the Baron's castle, but why? So he could work for the Demon Lord? It didn't help that his new friends didn't seem very talkative. Not that he was one to talk either. It took Loun much too long to realize his escorts were having difficulty seeing in the darkness. The stars in the moonless sky must not provide them with much light, but Loun could see as if the full moons were out. Even though they could not see that well, their reactions were incredible, leaping over gullies and avoiding rocks obscured by both darkness and vegetation. Past the hairy armpit of his designated carrier, Loun noticed distant heads bobbing above the grass blades. They were instantly recognizable, with green skin, large pointed ears and eyes that seemed to flow in the dark. Goblins. Loun did not recognize their facial tattoos, but he still felt he needed to greet them. He hesitated. What was the proper way to say hello in this game? The trio of barbarians answered his question by drawing their axes and rushing towards the nearest goblin. They must have seen the reflections off their goblin irises floating above the swaying grasses, eyes that glowed pinpricks of red. Loun did not like this one bit. While he should have expected it, he still wondered why everyone couldn't get along. Loun squirmed, slipped out of the barbarian's grasp, and fell to the ground head first. He landed as gracefully as a rock, the soft grass thankfully cushioning his fall. A shout rang from his bearer which brought the other two up short. The goblins, startled by the noise, ducked down into the neck-high grass. Neck-high for goblins and dwarfs. It was waist-high for the humans. Instead of attacking the hidden enemies, the barbarians halted, drew their axes, tilted their heads, and listened. Only the swishing of the endless wind through the grasses could be heard. With a sinking feeling in his gut, he knew that if he did nothing, it was likely that there would be a fight and someone, likely the goblins, would get hurt. But he hesitated. It was a game. They would come to no real harm if they did perish because it was all part of the game. Loun began stroking his own beard nervously. Loun had forgotten he had one. It stood to reason that he would, since dwarfs, even the women, were known to have voluminous beards. It was just that in all the excitement he had forgotten about it. Now that he thought about it, his face did feel comfortably warm during the flight and subsequent hauling. But he needed to think. Not a little consideration, but a think with a capital T. It was not something he considered his strong suit. And think he did. The UVR game was strange. There was still no hint of a menu system, so he could not log out. After the castle, he had tried again with verbal commands like quit and leave and log out, but these just gave him crazy looks from the musclemen as they had traversed the grasslands. The game was certainly immersive, he would give it that. But none of that would help save the goblins. Then he heard the whispering. At first he thought it was one of the humans, but it didn't match their gruff voices. It was more insistent and alluring. A wordless whisper on the wind. While the big guys shifted their feet, readying their axes for the goblin assault, Loun tilted his head this way and tried to locate the source. That way? No. The other? He took a few steps one way and then turned around to walk the other way. It was closer now. More insistent. It grew to a crescendo as he walked and suddenly stopped as his boot nudged a rock, covered in rounded nodules, out of the sand. He picked up the rock, which was far heavier than he had expected, and saw that it glinted with a metallic sheen in the starlight. Was this what was calling to him? Maybe it was a weird dwarven ability that made him sense particularly fine metals nearby. An urge to smack the rock began to grow inside him. Not to relieve frustrations or out of anger, but to hear the song the rock made when it was struck. The game's interface could have been less cryptic, Loun thought to himself as he steadied the metallic rock against another and raised his hammer to strike it. The hammer, that Loun hadn't realized he had pulled out from the loop on his belt, felt eager to fulfill its duty. Loun brought the hammer down with all his might. The rock rang out like a struck bell announcing the beginning of the battle. Goblins leapt from their hiding places in the grasslands, flint-tipped wooden spears pointed towards the barbarians. But the battle-hardened humans were ready, deflecting and dodging before swinging back. Instead of the ringing tone falling away, it kept rising in pitch and growing in strength and intensity. Loun thought his eardrums would burst at that single note. No one else seemed to notice as they continued fighting. A goblin fell to the ground with a bloody gurgle after being struck by an overhead swing by a barbarian. The rock's ringing sound was at once the most awful cacophony and the sweetest of music Loun had ever heard. The rock beneath his hammer shimmered and warped as the tone wept from it. Within the sound, Loun tasted colors and saw smells as a miniature universe unfolded before him. A universe with infinite interconnected possibilities begging Loun to choose from countless choices. He chose one that fit the world he was in, a sword. Within the continual ringing he heard whispers again. They were wordless, but held a hint of congratulations and praise. They pleased him and in turn they were pleased with him. When the sound ended, instead of a metallic hunk of rock, a complete dark-bladed sword lay under his hammer. The handguards were pronged like antlers and the pommel ended in a sharp spike, giving the blade a wicked look. Loun picked it up, marveling at its lightness and sinister beauty. Loun did not consider himself a fighter, nor did he believe that UVR gave him any kind of advantage in that field. In UVR he was a blacksmith, and blacksmiths famously were not known for martial prowess. But that did not stop him from swinging at the nearest muscled human with his newly created blade. Even though the barbarian was completely caught off guard, he still began to sidestep Loun's swipe. But it was too late. The blade connected with the unarmored body and with a purple flash, cleaved straight through it. Combat around them ground to a halt as the goblins' and barbarians' attention turned towards Loun, and the now halved human that lay unmoving on the flattened grass. The body didn't disappear as Loun expected it would. It lay there, silently accusing Loun of treachery. Loun shook the doubts from his mind and pointed the business end of his weapon at the two remaining barbarians. In the clearing of flattened grass, crushed by the melee of the 6 spear-wielding goblins and the 3 axe-wielding humans, one combatant from each lay defeated on the ground. The fallen goblin had disappeared in a multitude of glowing blue fragments, leaving behind a sack of possessions. That had been more in line with what Loun expected. He glanced at the downed barbarian, but the unmoving body still remained. "You've made a terrible mistake there," one of the remaining humans said to Loun. "Now we gonna cut you down and deliver your skull to the Baron." It sounded like a terrible threat, but Loun remembered that if players were defeated in combat they could be captured, and usually held for ransom through one simple mechanism, by collecting the loser's skull. When that player logged in again, they would appear where their skull was. Faced with a pair of angry barbarians, Loun turned the blade on himself. They couldn't get the skull if he defeated himself. Or had that exploit been patched? Loun's blade hovered near his own neck. He wasn't certain he could keep the doubt and fear from his eyes as his hands trembled, however the blade did not so much as quiver. He might be able to get out of the game this way, but what if he was wrong? Would he stake his life on it? He wasn't a gambler, nor was he particularly courageous. After a moment he dropped the sword and sat down heavily on his own hands to stop them from shaking. The sword pegged into the ground, hilt to the sky, quivering as if begging Loun to wield it once more, while a cry of pain filled the air. While Loun had been struggling with himself, the goblins had taken advantage of the distraction and moved into flanking positions around the barbarians. One of the humans let out a scream as a spear pegged him in the thigh. The yell coincided with Loun's dropping his weapon and became the signal for the barbarians to jump back into combat. The 5 remaining goblins closed in around the 2 humans. The pair of barbarians were bigger, stronger, and had more experience. One barbarian took a spear to his side, but before the attacker could celebrate, the human had cleaved through the shorter green skin. "He got me. I'm shazzing dying over here," the goblin screamed, as he writhed on the ground. "Get over it." Another goblin answered as the human took the opportunity to silence the wounded greenskin properly. While the slain goblin disappeared into brightly colored blue motes of light, it was evident the humans were tiring, but they still stood strong. The goblins would perish if Loun did nothing. With shaking hands he took up the blade again and rejoined the battle. The tide of battle had shifted to the goblins' advantage when Loun joined, even as inexperienced as he was. The wicked blade he swung made up for his lack of skill. A master will tell you that fighting a beginner is extremely dangerous as they are unpredictable and lack the sense of self-preservation. One barbarian felt the bite of Loun's blade and fell to the ground, cut from shoulder to opposite hip. "Good on ya, bear die. Shows them who's boss," a goblin cheered. "Special jib attack," yelled another goblin and leapt in front of the final barbarian's axe, grabbing hold of the blade with his forehead while grabbing the haft and refusing to let go, temporarily disarming the human as he attempted to free the axe from the goblin. Loun took the opportunity and stuck his blade straight through the barbarian, stopping just short of touching the goblin with the tip. Both goblin and human crumpled to the ground, dead, leaving the sound of panting all around. "Phew. Tight one," a goblin said as he caught his breath while the 3rd fallen goblin's corpse disappeared in a font of pretty lights. "That is what he said," another goblin replied, flopping onto his back on the ground, tiredly laughing at his own joke. For a second time, Loun sat down heavily and threw his blade away as if it were a snake. What if this was his reality now? How could he know that it was just a game? He glanced at the 3 human bodies. If it was a game, they should have disappeared in a puff of lights, leaving behind their loot and a skull. That was how it was supposed to work. Like where the 3 fallen goblins had been, now sacks remained. The remaining goblins' banter didn't help matters. What now? He had killed off the supposed allies that Baron Dimitri had left him with. Did that make him the vampire's enemy now? Laun was confused and didn't know which direction to go. Onwards to the Baron's castle? Or back to, where? Nick was the only one he knew except for the goblins. The goblins had strolled closer and collected all the fallen comrades' remains before coming to stand before the still-sitting dwarf. Looks like we owe you one, friend, the first goblin said while the others nodded. Not many would stand up for goblinkind, so you have our thanks. We name you Goblin Friend, and should you have need of us, call us. And we shall be there, the goblin said solemnly as he swore the goblin oath. The second goblin giggled, still lying on the ground. That was cheesier than the stuff growing between my toes, Hawk. Shut up, Jerd. I am in character. You are ruining everything again. Hawk spat back indignantly. I thought it was pretty cool, the third goblin muttered. Shut up, Reeb, Hawk and Jerd said together before all 3 burst into laughter. Hawk slapped Laun on the shoulder a few times. Don't mind them. They are all idiots. We're not stupid. You are stupid, Jerd interjected. Ignoring the others, Hawk continued, we are taking Jib, Joel and Clyde to go be reezed. He hefted a sack with 3 goblin skulls in it. You wouldn't believe how many other players pick on us just because we are goblins, but this time we showed them. No penalties for us this time. Hey! Why don't you come meet our elder? Laun nodded, picked up his sword and made it disappear before walking alongside the 3 chatting goblins, leaving the human bodies behind. As they disappeared into the night, their conversation drifted over the clearing of crushed grass. You don't know of any goblin eaters playing the game, do you? You know? Goblinettes? Shame. Real shame. Thank you for listening to part 2. If you would like to hear part 3 of this story, add a like and comment. Your support is greatly appreciated.